Greetings. This will be the makeup lecture for Tuesday, March 6th for Japanese history. And the lecture's topic is going to be on Korea, specifically how Korea ends up becoming a colony of Japan. I want to deal with some of the problems in how we understand the relationship between Japanese and Korean history. One, of course, is just the problem of language and research. East Asian languages are very difficult, and it takes a while to get really used to them and to become familiar with them, so that you can use gain access to both the secondary and the primary language resources. And the problem is usually people are only really good at one and at most two of those languages. And of course, it's good to know at least three: Japanese, Chinese, and Korean if you're going to study the area, as well as perhaps some other Western languages. French or Russian, and so forth. So it's really difficult to study these areas in some way. And that's, again, this is why the community of scholars is so important, right? We need to be able to talk to each other and to share research and so forth. And the simple fact of the matter is that more people study Japan than Korea. History is a little bit more advanced in Japan in some ways than in Korea. You can just see this if you go to a library and look at the amount of Japanese books and the amount of Korean books written in English, and especially you'll notice about half of the Korean books are on the Korean War. And also Japan has been a wealthier country longer than Korea, so they have more money to fund scholars studying the area. So you're just going to see they're just a little bit more advanced in Japan than we are. Remember, I'm a Koreanist, so I say we. Than we are in these ways, and so we have some catching up to do. And so there's going to be more books and more articles, and this thing gives the Japanese perspectives, people using Japanese sources, a bit more influence in how we think about these things, because it's their voices that are getting out. And there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. We need those voices to get out. But it is problematic if we don't have people looking at Korean history as well to the same extent. And it's difficult if you are writing on this subject without bringing Korean perspectives in. So, for example, I often see in Japanese books on the period a kind of tendency to blame the victim, in a sense, and a tendency to say, well, it was Korea's fault that it got colonized. It's not really Japan's fault. And of course, this brings up some issues too. Of course, it's hard just to lay blame on just one side or the other. But what I've seen is often there's a tendency to say, well, it's really the Koreans' fault that they got colonized. If only Koreans would have acted differently, they would have escaped colonization. And this is often done from the perspective and accepting the assumptions of Japanese that they had to have their way in Korea. And this, I think, is problematic. So I'm going to be talking, and of course this class is focusing on Japanese history, so it's a Japanese history class, right? So we focus on Japan. But I'm going to talk a little bit here in this lecture about the Japanese Empire from a Korean perspective, so we can kind of get an idea of the difficulties that Koreans faced, and why, in a sense, they today in Korea there's a lot of anger at Japan. Now, Korea was described by a 19th century German advisor working for the Japanese government as a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. And in saying this, he may have been thinking of what it was like, of course, in the 13th century for Japan, when the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, had used Korea as a staging port and forced Koreans to participate in an invasion of Japan, which of course was defeated in part by the kamikaze, the divine wind. But at the same time, this dagger, of course, could be wielded by Japan itself, right? Because, of course, that's what Hideyoshi tried to do when he invades Korea in an effort to invade China. So the key thing here is this German advisor realized that Korea was an extremely important strategic area, and that it was in Japan's security interest to make sure it wasn't used as a dagger against Japan. And so this is kind of Japan's strategic situation. Is Korea is a very, very close country. It doesn't have a particularly strong government, and if someone is to take it over, this would cause problems. Now, for hundreds of years, this didn't matter because Korea managed to maintain, essentially was kind of a demilitarized zone. It was friendly with China, it was friendly with Japan, it didn't itself have a large army, and from the Japanese perspective, that was kind of a good thing, right? But this is going to change with the rise of empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries, where you're going to have these powerful countries that are going to attempt to push aside this weak Korean government, essentially. Now, of course, what this doesn't also figure in from the Korean perspective, of course, is the Koreans are living on knife's edge, in a sense. They're living on the dagger. And their strategic concerns, of course, are to try and maintain their independence and make sure that they themselves don't get taken over by a foreign country, which unfortunately they are not going to be able to do. Now, many Koreans accepted what we call the Sinocentric world order, which basically saw China as the center of the world, not the center of the whole universe, right? Because the emperor is the son of heaven, the one mediator between heaven and earth, the only one who can sacrifice to heaven, in fact. And this is reflected in the fact that China called itself the Middle Kingdom, right? It's the center. And also the idea that there was, you could have one emperor, and that was it. Only one emperor in the world. The best you could do if you weren't the Chinese emperor was to be a king, which is what the Korean monarchs were called, kings. And in this worldview, there's essentially, it's essentially made up of unequal states, right? Theoretically, in the system we live in, according to international law, a small country such as Monaco or the Vatican is equal to a large country like the United States or India or China, legally speaking. But in this system, of course, the Sinocentric system, there's China and then everyone else, and everyone else relates to China depending on their level of civilization. And by civilization, it's meant how much they look like China, right? If you accept the Chinese culture, particularly Confucianism, if you write Chinese, especially if you write good Chinese poetry, if you dress similarly to Chinese people and accept Chinese family relationships and Chinese rituals, then you will be considered civilized. And Korea counted as one of these countries. In fact, especially in the relationship between Joseon and Ming China and Joseon and Qing China, Korea was considered kind of an ideal vassal state, right? The relationship between them was understood as older brother and younger brother, or in this sense. So Korea was considered a civilized country by the Qing, and accepted, and by the Ming, and Korea accepted Chinese overlordship and paid the Chinese tribute. Now, why accept this? Why accept being a younger brother? Why not urge to push to be the older brother? Why accept being a vassal to China, right? Well, there were several reasons. One reason was that even though Korea had to pay tribute, oftentimes the tribute they paid would be returned back to them and more by gifts from the Chinese emperors when they would come. So tributes, well, sometimes it could be pretty bad, especially under the Mongol Yuan dynasty. At other times, tribute didn't really amount to much of an expense, or could even result in getting more gifts of greater value back than were given in the first place. And also, being able to go to Beijing gave you the opportunity to trade, to learn new information, to make contacts, and so forth. So expense-wise, it wasn't that bad, right? And in fact, you can even make a bit of a profit. Another reason it was accepted was, of course, by accepting Chinese overlordship, you borrowed the legitimacy of the Chinese emperor. Chinese emperors confirmed Korean kings, and this gave them a certain amount of legitimacy, right? We've been accepted, especially since Koreans were elites, were part of this kind of Confucian culture. But another key reason why Koreans accept this is that it's a good security decision. By accepting China as the overlord, Koreans are saying, look, we're on your side, we are fellow Confucians, we're not going to bother you, we're not going to act against your interests, we are also civilized, therefore there is absolutely no need to invade us. And to the Chinese, they say, okay, why spend all this time and energy trying to take over a country that is going to work with us anyway? And so a lot of this is about security, right? It protects Koreans. And also we need to stress, this is also what makes things tricky, is that in the 19th century there's a tendency that you're either a colony or you're colonized. You're either an independent country or you're not. And things were a little more tricky under the Sinocentric world order. Koreans, even though Korea was a vassal state, even though it was the younger brother, it was an independent country. Koreans maintained their own army, they maintained their own tax structure, they maintained their own diplomacy. They had diplomatic relations, for example, with China. I'm sorry, not only with China, but with Japan and the Ryukyu Islands. And I think they even accepted tribute from the Ryukyu Islands. So the key thing here is that by accepting China as your overlord, you didn't really give up much. You didn't lose a lot of money. You maybe even got some back. It guaranteed your security, and you got access to Chinese culture. And it didn't mean you gave up your independence. And that's something I need to make very clear, is that Korea was still an independent country. Koreans were still capable of governing themselves at this time. Now, Japan was not particularly wedded to the Sinocentric world order. So in 1868, when you had the Meiji Restoration, there was no problem with claiming that the Japanese emperor was equal to the Chinese emperor. And especially, of course, it made sense to make such claims. At the very least, you would think they were equal. Most Japanese, I'm sure, thought that the Japanese emperor was better than the Chinese emperor. After all, Chinese had many dynasties because their emperors kept losing the mandate of heaven, whilst the Japanese emperors had only had one dynasty because they had the mandate of heaven, and being so virtuous and divine in nature, they had lost it. But in any case, with the Meiji Restoration, you have a group of people rise to power who are very loyal to the emperor, and who are not wedded to these old ideas. And so what happens is they send diplomatic officials. Japan has been keeping diplomatic relations with Korea throughout for several hundred years, and so they send diplomats again to Korea, who say, "All right, this is what's happened. We've had this restoration. The emperor is now in power, and everything's great." And they come in. When they do this, they use Chinese characters to refer to their emperor that Koreans had reserved only for the Chinese emperor. Right? And they also wear Western clothing, and this really disturbs the Koreans. And the Koreans say, "We can't accept this letter. This is you're becoming like barbarians, and this isn't the appropriate way to refer to your emperor. There's only one emperor. He's in China, and so you need to leave and don't come back essentially until you fix this." And so what happens then is there's this debate in Japan over whether or not they should actually conquer Korea because of this insult to their emperor. And it's essentially decided that, hey, this is too, we can't do this right now. We're too weak. We can't go out and conquer another country. So they decide not to do this. And remember, this is also when Saigo Takamori leaves the government, and then in 1877 will lead the rebellion in Satsuma. So what they do instead, though, is in 1875, several flotilla of Japanese ships go to Korea, violate Korean waters by a fortress by the Konghwa Fortress, and the Konghwa Fortress guards the entrance to the Han River, which if you take the Han River, it takes you to the capital. So it's a very important fortress. And the Japanese ships press very closely. The Koreans fire a warning shot to tell them to leave. They don't, and so the Koreans fire on them. The Japanese fire back and storm the forts and take the forts, and then claim that they were fired upon without provocation. So essentially they provoked this incident because then they could use that as an attempt to force Korea to sign a modern treaty with Japan. And that's essentially what happens. The young king of Korea is afraid that if the Koreans don't sign this treaty, that it's going to cause them a lot of problems, that they're going to that Japan will invade and basically take over the country. So they signed this treaty with Japan, which basically it's really an amazing treaty because it is an unequal treaty. In fact, it's more unequal than the one that the United States forced Japan to sign back in 1858. So this is really striking. The Japanese are definitely learning how to be an empire and how to use it well. They forced Korea to open several ports, and Koreans have even less tariff autonomy than the Japanese do. Japanese enjoy extraterritoriality and so forth. So it's this is basically how the relationship then is changed, and Japan has learned very well from Perry the lessons of empire. Now, what will change this is the Tonghak Rebellion. Basically, going back to 1884, right? You have this coup attempt by the Koreans. The Chinese send troops and drive out those Korean reformers and their Japanese allies. And you then had a situation where you had China and Japan both had troops in Korea, and they had to figure out how to defuse the situation without causing a war. So Li Huangjiang and Ito Hirobumi sat down and came up with a deal where they would both withdraw troops from Korea, and in exchange then and if either one of them was to send troops in the future, they would inform the other one who would also have the right to send troops to Korea. Now, even though this meant China withdrew its troops, China was still the victor, essentially. It still had power over Korea because it had Yuan Shikai there, but also because and that happened because the Korean government was still essentially pro-Chinese. So, like I said, between this period of 1884 to 1894, you have a pro-Chinese government in Korea in power. Now this starts to change because you have the Tonghak Rebellion in 1894 and 1895, and Tonghak means Eastern learning, and it was basically a religion that was founded in 1860 in Korea as a reaction to Sohak, which was Western learning, that is Catholicism. And so this was a religion that starts in 1860. It's persecuted by the government, and unlike Christians at this time in Korea who have foreign protectors, the Tonghak don't have anything like that. So while as Christians are beginning to enjoy more and more freedom they didn't have before, the Tonghak don't enjoy that. They're often kind of suppressed by the government. They run into lots of difficulties, and also there's people in Korea who are having difficulties because of the changes that a market economy is bringing. Right? You have, as Japanese influence grows in Korea, as Chinese influence grows into Korea, Korea is becoming involved in a global market, and this changes patterns of farming and ownership and so forth. And there's people who are losing because of this, people who are being forced into tenancy or being forced to be just peasant proprietor, or forced to be just losing all their land basically, and forced to just sell their labor. And these people are having, and so there's a lot of Korean peasants who are having a difficult time. And a lot of this comes from the encroach of foreigners into Korea, basically. And so what happens is you have this combination of economic problems and suppression, attempts to suppress this religion, and this leads to a rebellion, right? And this is common in pre-modern East Asian societies, is that you'll have a religious group that will then launch a rebellion, and then all these people will end up joining it, because once the rebellion starts, right, it's much easier to join. It's getting the thing started. And you can think of these rebellions as like a snowball, right? It starts off small, and you roll it down the hill, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it picks up more and more snow. And that's essentially what's happening. And so these people, Tonghak start a rebellion in 1894 in hopes of driving out the Japanese and getting their government to go back to the Confucian way. This is essentially a conservative rebellion. And of course they also want the government to stop persecuting their religion. And because of this, then the Korean king sends troops to put down the rebellion. They're defeated, and the rebellion is doing quite well. And so what happens eventually is that the Korean king asks China to send troops. And China sends troops, and according to that deal they had made with Japan back in 1884, Japan also has the right to send troops. So Japan sends troops to Korea as well. And what this leads to then, right, 10 years previously, you had this kind of standoff between China and Japan, right, over this coup. And Japan backed down, and part of the reason, and agreed to withdraw troops, and one reason Japan backed down was because they didn't feel they were powerful enough to face off against China at this time. Things are different in 1894. The Japanese feel that they can take China in a war, and so basically China says, after the Tonghak Rebellion is put down, China says, okay, we put down the rebellion, let's all go home, we'll bring our troops home, and Japan will bring its troops home, and we'll just go back to the way things were, which is to mean where China dominates Korea. And Japanese said, nope, we should stay here and reform Korea because the Korean government is too weak. Let's carry out these reforms together. And of course, by Japan knew that China would never agree to this, because to carry out the reforms together would give Japanese more power and more influence. And sure enough, this didn't. China refused to do this, and then this gave them a cause of war. And so China and Japan then fought a war with each other. And of course, this war was known as the Sino-Japanese War, and we talked about this previously in a previous class. I won't go into it too much, except to remind you, of course, that it is the Japanese who win this war, defeat the Chinese utterly, and this gives Japan lots of power in Korea. So now, because Korea has won this, Japan rather has won this war, it now is really the rising power in Korea. It completely dominates the country. There's no one else who has as much power as Japan does in Korea at this time. And so what this leads then is it allows progressive pro-Japanese Koreans to link up with Japanese Korean, or I'm sorry, with the Japanese, and to bring a lot of the radical reforms, or to at least start them, which Japan had undergone, right? So this is an effort to let's take out radical reforms to be like Japan, and this is leads to what the so-called Cabo reforms of 1895 to 1896. Now, Queen Min and her clan, who remember are pro-Chinese, and this is her picture right here, say are very resistant to these reforms because, of course, they'll take away their power. Right, these are reforms similar to the Meiji reforms, right, which are radical, and which are, as we saw, destroyed basically the power of the old elites, destroyed the power of the samurai, and that's eventually what these reforms would do as well. So the men are very resistant to this, right, and so Japan is kind of in a problem, and the pro-Japanese are having a problem too, because the men are still a force, and they're not able to take out reforms to the extent that they want. And so the Japanese consul in Korea decides that they need to get rid of Queen Min. And so he basically organizes a plot where a bunch of Korean and Japanese toughs go into the palace and chop up poor Queen Min with swords and kill her, and then burn her body with gasoline. And this is an extremely clumsy, not to mention very horrifying act. Of course, it's found out who did this, that the Japanese were behind this, and this leads to a lot of very anti-Japanese feeling, right? Even though Queen Min wasn't always that popular with her people, she was still their queen, and she certainly shouldn't be assassinated. And so this caused a lot of Korean anger. A lot of Koreans turned against Japan, and of course a lot of Westerners were also not particularly happy about this. And this made Japan look very bad internationally. It made it look doubly bad because despite putting the consul and some other people on trial, no one was ever found really guilty or punished for this. And of course the other problem it created was it really frightened King Kojong, Queen Min's husband, the king, right? He was really disturbed by this and was afraid that he himself would be killed. And what's really striking is to give an idea of how frightened he was, he would only take food that had been prepared for him by Protestant ministers, or by their wives, rather. The wives would make the food, they would put it in a lock box, and the Protestant minister would then take the food to the king, who would then unlock it. Right? So this is not good when you're the king, and this is the kind of situation you're in. And so what happens then is that these same ministers help King Kojong escape to the Russian legation in 1896. Right? So I just want to stress, this is a very, very bad time for Korea. I mean, their queen has been assassinated. Their king is forced to flee to a foreign legation in order to feel safe, right? And this, of course, is very bad for Japan, because now that they've killed the queen and the king has fled, they don't have any legitimacy to work the reforms in Korea that they thought were necessary, right? And what's key to stress here is that from the Japanese perspective, there was a desire to create these kind of radical reforms in Korea in order to strengthen Korea so that it would be able to withstand Western imperialism. They wanted a free, independent, and strong Korea that wouldn't be a security threat. But to do that, they kind of ran into a contradiction, right? They want an independent Korea, but they basically are threatening Korea's independence by doing things like killing the queen and forcing reforms that necessarily not all Koreans want. So Japan is in kind of a conundrum in this regard, right, where it's claiming to be acting on behalf of Korean independence, but at the same time is encroaching on Korean independence. And as we see here, it's certainly not making any friends in Korea with such actions. Now in 1897, the Korean king is able to return from the legation, and because of some Russian diplomatic blunders, Russia basically loses influence over him. And so now Korea actually has kind of an opportunity in which it can reform. as an independent country, right? Japanese influence is gone, or limited, I should say. Chinese influence is limited. Russian influence is limited, right? And so now there's an attempt to become radical, or to reform. And so the emperor immediately after, basically almost immediately in the same year he's released from the he leaves the Russian legation. He declares that Korea is now not just a kingdom, it's an empire, and he says we're now the Great Han Empire, the Taehan Empire. And he's no longer a king, he's now an emperor. And this seems kind of a funny thing to do, right? I mean, Korea is incredibly weak at this time. It's hard to say it's an empire, but of course the reason he does this is to claim equality with China and Japan. And you can see in this then the complete rejection of the old Sino-Centric worldview. And so the king is willing to undergo then some reform. And you can see this here in this picture, in this uniform, right? He's looking like that picture we had of Emperor Meiji. He's got a Western-style military uniform covered with medals. He's got a sword. His hand is on the sword. He's a man ready for action, right? But the tricky thing here is that the king was essentially conservative, and he was not going to allow any reforms that would limit the power of the monarchy, right? But as we saw with Japan, and as we're seeing, it's Japan's willingness to give power to the people, in a sense, that allows them to harness their energy, and this is what makes it, in part, helps Japan to become independent, or to maintain its independence, rather, and to become an empire in itself, its ability to kind of go along with nationalism. But Korea is just not interested in undertaking such radical reforms, because those will destroy the power of the old landed elite. They'll limit the power of the king, and so forth, right? There's this, so this reform is very conservative, and it's just, even though there's some things that would make Korea strong, it just isn't going far enough. But this wasn't the only limitation that Koreans faced. One thing was they just didn't have time. Right, as we'll see, they only have about 7 years to do this, and they didn't have money. Korean government was not very good at extracting resources from its people. The officials and the elite were good at extracting resources for their own needs, but the government itself was not able to do that very well. And so Koreans never really had the money that was needed to undertake reforms, and so this was a serious problem. And also just Korea's strategic situation. Geographically speaking, Japan was a group of islands. It was much easier for it to maintain its independence. It wasn't considered really that much of a strategic threat to anyone. Korea, on the other hand, was considered strategically important, and so no one was going to really leave it alone. So there was an increasing pressure on the country. And so essentially then when the Russo-Japanese War breaks out, Japan places troops in Korea, forces Korea to take its side in the war, and this ends the attempts at government reform. Now, what's key to stress is that even though Koreans hadn't developed a sense of nationalism, a sense of themselves as having a strong loyalty to the state, and that their interests in the state were one, most Koreans didn't feel that way at this period. The state was something to fear. The state was something to avoid when you could. Similar to how Japan was in many respects during the Tokugawa period. There were Koreans who were increasingly seeing that their fate was tied to the fate of their state, and that they wanted to form a strong independent nation state in order to maintain their freedom. And this is key, is that many of these people were not involved in the government, right? That they were interested in taking part, or in bringing reforms and so forth, as private citizens rather than as public officials. And a lot of these people looked around and they said, well, we have kind of a problem. We need a model. We need to know how to reform. The Chinese model clearly doesn't work, right? China lost the Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese model has some promise to it, certainly, but the Japanese are trying to take us over. So what do we do? Well, let's go back to the source. Let's go back to the West and see what they're doing. And let's look back and see why they're successful. And for many Koreans, and of course, if you want to go to this Western source, you go to the Protestant missionaries. Those are the Westerners you're most likely to be able to meet. Now, there's also Catholic missionaries, but they're a little different from the Protestant missionaries. Protestant missionaries see a very strong connection between religion, civilization, and power, right? They say because we have the most advanced religion, the most true religion, the best religion, it's because of that that the West became powerful, right? And so they draw this connection between religion, civilization, and power, and this makes sense to Confucian Koreans who were used to doing the same thing, right? Chinese civilization, Confucianism are true and good because, in a sense, they're the most powerful, right? And if we follow, this was a teaching in Confucianism that essentially, if you were virtuous, you would be powerful, and you have this kind of idea here as well. So there was a lot that went together here. Now the Catholic missionaries were a little different. They were from France, and there they saw modern civilization as hostile to religion and Christianity, so they weren't interested in this. But Protestant missionaries had a vision of a modern Christian, liberal, democratic society that was very powerful and that would bring benefits and humanitarian laws and so forth to wherever it was spread. And this was a very attractive vision to many Koreans. And so you had the growth of Korean Christian, especially Protestant Christian nationalists, who believed that by saving souls, they would save the nation, right? By bringing forth the moral reform that Christianity promised, that Christianity offered, this would create a moral reform among the Korean people, which would enable them to become stronger and save the country. And restore full Korean independence. And of course, this was very close to Confucian ideas, where by becoming a moral person, you can save the country in a sense. Now, what's important though too is that these Protestant missionaries didn't just offer good ideas, they also offered an organization, particularly churches, right? They formed church networks that united not only local communities, but also regional communities and national communities, and this allowed Koreans then to develop strong connections with each other, to pool resources, to support each other, to organize, to take action together, for example, to build schools, to build hospitals, and that sort of thing, and through schools and hospitals then to disseminate new knowledge. Also, for example, Protestant missionary connections could enable you to go study in the West, and some of the most important early Korean nationalists did just that. And so what you have here then with Protestant Christianity is you have a worldview that offers a way of saving the country, as well as the organizational support that will help you to realize that worldview. Now, not all Koreans embraced peaceful resistance. Some said there's not really time for this to work. We need to rise up and do something about this. We need to drive out these Japanese barbarians who are encroaching upon us. And there were quite a number of people who did this, and quite a number of these people died. I think by Japanese records, something like 14,000 Koreans were killed fighting against the Japanese. But you had all these little Korean armies called righteous armies, Uibyung, by the Koreans, who are popping up everywhere and fighting. So it's not just nonviolent calls for reform. There's also Koreans are also willing to take up arms to resist the government. And this is just important to point out because you did have Koreans who were very interested in maintaining their country's independence and who were willing to lay their lives on the lines. And I want to just share this poem by one of these men, Chung Hwan-jik. Chung was a Confucian righteous army leader who was eventually defeated and captured, and then sentenced to death by the Japanese court as a rebel. And so he wrote the night before his execution, "Though death lie in wait, can I betray my soul? Righteousness seems heavy, and death rather light. But to whom can I trust affairs when I am gone? So thinking in silence, dawn approaches already." So if we look from Chung's perspective, right, things are not good. Japan has just forced its way into Korea and is going about trying to force Koreans to change their customs, to change the old Confucian culture, which was the center of civilization, and is killing people who resist. And of course, for Chung, the question is, why are you doing this? We were just kind of sitting here minding our own business, and you came in here and started killing us, and then when we resisted, you say we're rebels, and you have us executed, as if we were criminals, when in fact we're patriots defending our country. right? And so this is kind of what I mean about the importance of trying to see a Korean perspective. We can talk from the Japanese perspective, right? About, well, you have the strategic problem that Japan is facing. It wants a strong, friendly government in Korea, and so we can understand why Japanese wanted to expand their influence. And that we do need to understand the perspective, but we also need to understand the Korean perspective, that, hey, we weren't doing anything, and you came in here and invaded us, and then when we tried to resist, you said we were rebels, and you executed us. And I think this is a perspective that needs to be considered, as well as just the idea it's hard to claim self-defense when you're invading someone else's country. So yeah, that's kind of the Korean perspective I want us to keep in mind. And that brings us to Thomas Anchung-gun. You will have an assigned reading by Anchung-gun, which myself and Han Ji-un translated. And so I think I need to talk a little bit more about this guy. And I'm very interested in him, in part because I wrote my dissertation on him. About 2/3 of my dissertation is dedicated to An. And you can see from his name that he starts off as or that he is a Christian. His name is Thomas Anchung-gun, and he was in fact a Catholic. And it's interesting how An becomes a Catholic. Basically, his dad started a militia during the Tonghak Rebellion and fought against the Tonghak because the Tonghak were also attacking rich landlords, and his father was certainly one of those. And he defeated the Tonghak, but then some government officials claimed that he had stolen rice, and he was forced to seek asylum in a Catholic church. And while he was there, he converted to Catholicism. And then Anchung-gun, because his dad converted to Catholicism, he did too, basically. But over time, he became a very, very sincere Catholic. Really, it's very clear from his documents he really believed in the religion. But he also hoped that it would help him to reform Korea and to make Korea into a powerful modern country. And so what he did, he and the priest who baptized him went to the Bishop of Korea and asked him to establish a university. The bishop said, no, if you do that, then and if Catholics get educated, they'll become indifferent to their faith. An was really horrified by this, and he declared that he could no longer trust missionaries, even though he would still believe in the Catholic faith. Now, he did continue to look to missionaries for advice, just not the bishop. And he did try through peaceful means to establish or to help build Korean independence. For example, he helped found and maintain schools, 2 schools to be exact. And it's interesting to note that both of these schools were connected to other Catholics, right? So you see how this importance of this network in an organization I talked about previously is. But An became convinced that such peaceful means didn't have time to work. And so in 1908, he joined a guerrilla army to fight the Japanese directly. His guerrilla army was defeated, and so he was forced to go into Manchuria, and he wasn't really sure what to do next. But then he heard that Ito Hirobumi was going to be coming through Manchuria, who you'll remember Ito was one of the important genro, one of the important elder statesmen. He would serve multiple times as prime minister. I believe he was prime minister during the Sino-Japanese War, for example. And he was basically framed the Japanese constitution, so a very important guy. Ito Hirobumi had also been sent to Korea as what's called the resident general of Korea. And basically Ito was the one who was behind, and certainly the public face, of the Japanese colonization of Korea, right? So when An heard that he was going to be traveling through Manchuria, he was overjoyed, because he said, now I can kill this guy, right? This guy who's been colonizing us, who's been taking us over. An blamed Ito for basically all the problems that Korea was suffering at this time. He even thought Ito had been behind the killing of Queen Min, which isn't entirely accurate. An thought it, though, because the assassins went unpunished, and Ito was prime minister at that time. He thought, therefore, that Ito was involved in it. But the key thing is that Ito is the public face of Japanese colonization in Korea. Even though he was no longer resident general in 1909, he's the one attached to it. So Anchung-gun goes to Harbin, Manchuria, where Ito is supposed to arrive. Ito gets off the train, and Anchung-gun shoots him, and Ito will die about 20 minutes later. And when Anchung-gun learns that he's dead, he makes the sign of the cross and says, "Thank God, the tyrant is dead." Or, I'm sorry, he says, "Thanks be to God," when he learns that Ito is dead. So, and by killing Ito, it's his hope that this will show Japanese people in the whole world that Koreans don't want to be a colony of Japan. That's kind of the idea here. Is that, and he also thinks that Ito has been tricking the world, telling everyone that the Koreans want to be a colony of Japan, and he tricked the Japanese emperor into thinking that Koreans want to be a colony of Japan, and that by killing Ito, everyone will see that Koreans don't want to be a colony of Japan, and either international pressure will force Japan to leave, or the Japanese emperor will change his policy in Korea. And that's kind of his goal, what he thinks will happen by killing Ito. That's not what happens, and An Shungun is put on trial, sentenced to, found guilty of murder, sentenced to death, and he is hung in the year 1910. Now I need to go back a couple years just to talk about how Korean independence then is finally destroyed, essentially. Right, An kills Ito in 1909. In 1910, An is executed. Right. Well, a few years before that, in 1907, there was a meeting at The Hague in the Netherlands, and that's not a misspelling, it's actually called The Hague, with a capital T. There was a peace conference going on, and Japan had forced Korea in the wake of the Russian-Japanese War to sign a treaty in 1905 that gave Koreans, or that basically made Korea a protectorate of Japan, where Japan then controlled Korea's army and controlled its diplomatic relations, and that's in the year 1905 following the Russo-Japanese War. The king wasn't very happy about that, and so during this peace conference in 1907, he sent a Korean delegation who were supposed to then say, who were supposed to protest what Japan had done. The delegation, the Japanese found out about it and prevented the delegation from being heard, and then used this as a opportunity to get rid of Emperor Kojong, because he was kind of a crafty old man, was causing them lots of trouble, and so he was forced to abdicate. And his son Sunjong was ascended to be the emperor. And Sunjong, we're not sure what was wrong with him, but he was a man of diminished mental capacities and was essentially a puppet ruler. And so as soon as and it's Ito Hirobumi who's doing this. Ito Hirobumi forces Emperor Kojong to abdicate, then has Emperor Sunjong ascend, and then immediately forces Emperor Sunjong to sign a new treaty, which basically allows Korea to basically makes Korea almost a complete colony of Japan. And this is why one of the key reasons why An kills Ito Hirobumi, because Ito Hirobumi does all this. And so in 1907, Korea is essentially a colony of Japan, but Japan is still, there's still a Korean government. Japan is still ruling through that government, and the idea is that the theory is that indirect rule will be cheaper and Koreans will find it more satisfactory, right? Because you keep the old Korean government. But it's very clear to Korean people that this is not a independent government, that their government is just a shell, it's just a puppet with Ito and the Japanese pulling the strings, and so Koreans still continue to resist. The Japanese are never really able to understand Koreans' desire for independence, and so they see, and of course the Koreans are often very resistant to Japanese reforms because they see these reforms as a way of increasing Japanese power, and the Japanese see such resistance as proof that the Koreans can't really handle things themselves, they can't reform, they can't make a modern country. And the whole project just seems to be very expensive, very difficult, and so why not just get rid of the Koreans? Why not just get rid of the Korean government? And so Korea is then formally annexed in 1910, and the royal family is basically married into the Japanese royal family, and there is no more Korean government. Right, there's only a Japanese government in 1910 that controls Korea, and so Korean independence is then destroyed, and Korea will remain a colony of Japan until 1945, when it will be liberated, only to essentially be divided. And so now today you have two different Korean governments, each claiming legitimacy over the entire peninsula. So basically this is the story of how Japan comes to annex Korea. What's key to stress in a large part about it is that this was in many ways a Japanese attempt to look for security, a Japanese attempt to find safety, again, because there's fears that if China or Russia control Korea, that will threaten Japanese security. The Japanese don't want to do that. And so in this sense, we can kind of understand where the Japanese were coming from. The problem is we also need to include the Korean perspective, right? The Japanese, in order to maintain their own independence, destroyed the independence of Korea and made it their own colony. And if we're going to try and play a game of what if, we can't just assume that it was the Koreans who were the only ones at fault, right? We can't just, in a sense, blame the victim. We also need to ask the questions of what if? What if Japan would have acted differently? What if Japan, instead of trying to become a land empire, would have stayed in the islands and built up its navy, or taken some other process, or engaged in some other activity in Korea? What would have happened there? And of course, we also can't just blame the Japanese. We also have to look at the West and what Western countries were doing, because of course they helped create an environment in which imperialism made sense, right? In which you're either colonized or you're the colonizer. So, and this is also important as we think about Japanese actions, especially as we go into World War II, is to not just look at Japan and say, oh, Japanese people are bad, that's why World War II happened. They were in many ways reacting in a quite rational way, in some ways, to what was going on in the wider world, and in particular into the attempts by Western countries to establish and maintain their own power. So we need to look at as many perspectives as possible when we consider these questions. And by way of conclusion, I want to just talk about briefly the Korean dilemma, what the Koreans were facing. And first of all was just the reality of power. They knew that Japan was a very powerful country, right? And so were the Western countries, and much more powerful than Korea. So they knew that they had to make some changes if they were going to maintain their independence. But also, they ran into this kind of dilemma of which comes first, the nation or civilization. And what we mean by that, or what I mean by that rather, is which is more important, national independence or emphasizing bringing civilized reforms, right? And remember, we talked about this. Civilized reforms are a good thing, right? They bring hygiene, they bring cures to disease, they bring various comforts, they make transportation easier, they bring education, right? Which is more important, enjoying the fruits of civilization or being an independent country, right? And if you emphasize being an independent country first, you're going to act like An Chung-gun, you're going to act like Chung Hwan-jik, you're going to take up arms and fight. If you emphasize civilization, you're going to push for reforms, and you're going to be more willing to work with the Japanese, right? Because you put civilization first. And you also have this question of who speaks for the nation, right? It's tricky, because what happens, is it the elites only? Is it the king? Right? But the kings, in many ways, are looking out mostly for their own interest, right? They're not willing to undertake reforms that might weaken them. Only reforms that will help strengthen them are going to be their primary thing. And this is the case that An Chung-gun runs into, right? Is that he claims that he can speak for the nation, and not the king, in a sense, because the king, or the emperor, I'm sorry, has been taken over and is just a puppet. And so this is an issue too. And you have also connected this idea of civilization, you have kind of a populism. There's a group in Korea called the Il-chin-hui, which basically means the Union and Advancement Society. And this group is a populist group who sees the Korean government as its enemy, right? The Korean government is extracting taxes, its officials are corrupt, it's causing all sorts of problems. And so these peasants and farmers, many of them who come from the Tonghak religion, see their own government as kind of their enemy, and they think that maybe they'll get a better deal if they support Japan, right? And so it's similar to civilization, right? It's people who are looking for tax benefits, who are hoping that, who see the Korean government as kind of their enemy. And a lot of also, if we look at, so if you're a Korean, it's difficult to know who to act and who speaks for the nation, which is more important, saving the nation or the fruits of civilization. Can you trust your own government? An Chung-gun, we don't have time to go into it. He certainly didn't trust his own government, even though he was a pro-Korean emperor. He didn't particularly like Korean officials because they would often go after his family and they would often persecute Catholics, from his perspective. So this was a certain issue. And then also, so if you're a Korean, you face a very difficult situation. And you also have kind of personal proclivities, right? What do I mean by that? If you're a scholar, you're not as likely maybe to want to go out and fight, right? So you're more likely to embrace non-violent reform. On the other hand, if you're someone like An Chung-gun, An was a hunter, And so he knew how to use firearms very well. And so he not only was willing to kill Ito, he managed to do it. It's actually very hard to assassinate someone, but he was a good shot and was able to do it. And you also, we've talked a little bit about these ideologies in class, but I just want to review them because to make things even more complicated, you have this kind of idea of Pan-Asianism, right? This idea, hey, we can trust the Japanese. The Japanese are our fellow Asians, they're our fellow yellow people. They will help us, right? We can trust them. And so this makes things difficult because you're like, can we trust the Japanese? Can we trust them that they'll bring civilization while protecting our nation? And especially it's important to remember many Koreans are afraid of the Russians. They think the Russians are going to take over. So these people will say, hey, look, we can trust the Japanese certainly more than we can trust the Russians, right? We got to kind of make a choice because they're both very powerful. And then you also have this doctrine of social Darwinism, which basically is saying the Chinese way of saying this, if you translate social Darwinism to Chinese characters, is the elite eat and the weak are meat, right? And there's this idea that, in a sense, if you get taken over, it's your own fault. It's your own fault. So there's a lot of Koreans who say maybe we have this coming, right? We live in this kind of world in which people eat or are eaten. Maybe we had this coming. Maybe this is kind of our own fault. And so this becomes an issue too, because there's this idea maybe in order to avoid being completely eaten, being completely destroyed, we need to throw in our lot with Japan. So I hope, I hope this has helped us to kind of see how Japan is acting in history and how it's kind of seen its actions influence someone else, because of course it's Japanese power that provoke many of these questions for Korea. And we'll come back to this as we progress through our course.